Hey everyone, thank you for having me. So today I'd like to talk about our assumptions around how open source gets built, how we think it gets built, and what is and isn't working. I started looking into open source as a pure personal curiosity a couple of years ago, and it ended up turning into my full-time focus at GitHub for a couple of years. And I learned from talking to hundreds of maintainers that open source projects don't have as many meaningful contributors as we think they do, despite everybody relying on this code. And so for the first couple of years, I operated off this assumption that that was the issue, that we just needed to get more people to contribute back to these projects. But after looking at them a little bit more closely, I realized the problem was a little more complex than that. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So to start off and kind of just orient ourselves to the kinds of problems that we're seeing in open source today, let's start with an experience you might be familiar with if you've ever tried to make an open source contribution. So let's say you're using an open source tool at work and you run into an issue. In this case, it was a confusing error message in a code coverage tool. You're feeling ambitious that day, so you're like, all right, I can fix this. You go into the repo, you pull down the code, you make your changes, you open a pull request. You write up a nice little explanation to go with it, and you're feeling pretty proud of yourself. One of the maintainers responds the next day, reviews your contribution, everything's looking good. You immediately make the requested changes, and then you wait. And you wait, and you start pinging the thread, and it seems like no matter how many times you ping them, maintainer seems to have completely disappeared. They've just ghosted. This PR is still open, by the way. And so now you start to feel a little silly, but you're like, fine. That's cool and all. I didn't need you to take my contribution, but also, what the heck? Isn't this open source? Don't projects want contributions? Well, it's possible that this maintainer didn't like the contribution after all. It's also possible that the project isn't being actively developed anymore. But another thing that might be happening is this. Maybe your contribution got lost in a sea of hundreds of unanswered issues and pull requests that are piling up on a maintainer's inbox, and in turn, their guilty conscience. Maybe. Open source maintainers are fighting an information battle. They start off with a project, it's fun at first, then the notifications start piling up, so they start responding faster, and then that leads to even more notifications. There's an odd productivity paradox that applies here, which you might have experienced with your own email. You respond to 10 emails, you get 15 back. Because efficiency breeds more work, you start getting trapped in this cycle of notifications, and now you've found that somehow the better you do, the worse your life gets. So what's going on here? Why are maintainers feeling overwhelmed, and why is this a new or interesting problem? Well, part of the problem is that more people are using and participating in open source than ever before. So in 2001, when open source first came onto the scene, SourceForge, which was the dominant code hosting platform at the time, had just over 200,000 users. Today, GitHub has 36 million registered users, and this number has more than doubled in just the past 2 years. According to GitHub, they had more new users in 2018 than in their first 6 years combined. And not only are there more people, but the definition of a popular project has changed, with these projects getting way more downloads than ever before. So in 1998, you have a big successful project like Netscape Browser, and it got 180,000 downloads in its first 2 weeks, which sounds like a lot. But today, you have a single package like Webpack, which is one of many modules that a JavaScript developer might use, and just that gets 15 million downloads in the same time span. And so now projects are seeing this exponential growth in use. But on the production side, turns out there's been little to no increase in the number of people maintaining these projects. So you fast forward today, and 2/3 of popular projects just have 1 or 2 maintainers. That's even more extreme for certain ecosystems. So if you're to look at NPM specifically, it's more like 93% of packages that have just 1 maintainer. And a 2014 study found that there is no relationship between how many people depend on a package versus how many maintainers it has. And so to some extent, software projects can absorb that kind of growth, right? So like if users just took their code and kind of went off into the sunset, everything might actually be okay. But if you've ever spent some time browsing open issues on a project, you know that's not the way it really works. Part of what's compounding the problem is that it's not just random hobby developers that are using open source now, but really big, serious companies too. So most companies now say that they use open source to run their business. And as you can see from this survey, that number doubled from 2010 to 2015. In a survey that we ran at GitHub a couple years ago, we found that 94% of respondents say they use open source at least sometimes in their professional work. So now if you're a maintainer, you've got not just random developers, but Fortune 500 companies that are using your stuff in production, demanding you to fix things. Example of how this can go wrong is the recent event stream compromise last fall, where malicious code was inserted into a popular package in order to steal users' money. And so this kind of headline, or the potential for this kind of headline, can cause a lot of mental burden for maintainers. But the really interesting thing here is how this particular story happened, which is that the attacker asked the maintainer for commit access to his project, and the maintainer just handed it to him. So the attacker was able to add the code themselves without any problem, which is like handing keys to your house to a complete stranger. And so Dominic, the maintainer, got a lot of flack for this. People were either criticizing him for being reckless, or they were trying to forgive him for what they considered to be an honest mistake. But Dominic didn't see this as a mistake. I'll try to read this out to you. So he completely stood by his decision. He said that far from being a mistake, giving commit access to strangers was considered a best practice for his fellow maintainers, which is true. He wanted to explain why maintainers would do something like this, which is that if it's not fun anymore, you get literally nothing from maintaining a popular package. He said, one time I was working as a dishwasher in a restaurant, and I made the mistake of being too competent, and I got promoted to cook. This is only a 50-cent an hour pay rise, but massively more responsibility. It didn't really feel worth it. Writing a popular module like this is like that times a million, and the pay rise is 0. Dominic's point was that these sorts of security compromises were reflective of a wider systemic issue, with the things that we expect maintainers to do and be responsible for, which are completely unrealistic today. Average maintainer of an open source project experiences something like this, with an unprecedented number of users flooding these projects with little to no increase in support. Maintainers have become victims of their own success. So before I dive deeper into this, I just want to take a step back and talk about what an open source maintainer is, since I'm going to keep using this term, and we're probably all coming in here with different ideas and definitions. For the purposes of this talk, I'm defining maintainers as people that are responsible for an open source project who have to do something besides writing code. So if you're reviewing other people's contributions, answering open issues, anything like that, congratulations, you're now a maintainer. And the maintainer role is really important in an open source project, even if there aren't a lot of them. And so to illustrate this idea, I'm going to borrow a concept from conservation biology called keystone species. Keystone species has a disproportionately large effect on its environment relative to its size. So they're named after the keystone in the middle of an arch structure, which bears the least amount of weight, but if you were to remove it, the entire arch would still collapse. So for example, if we imagined a forest, there might not actually be that many wolves in absolute numbers, but if the wolves disappeared, there would be no predators to eat the deer, and if there are too many deer, then the plants would grow out of control, and so on. It has a sort of cascading effect. So maintainers are like that. The project needs maintainers to do things like review and merge pull requests, answer issues, and keep the vision of the project together. Both users and contributors need things from maintainers. Project might have hundreds of contributors, but if you remove the maintainers, even if there are just a couple of them, you could put the whole project in jeopardy. And so that's why maintainers are important. Without them, you've got unanswered issues, unmerged PRs, and dead or stagnant projects. And so we're placing a lot of demand on maintainers these days, and the short-term response has been a bunch of these coping strategies. Stuff like limiting your time on open source, getting better at saying no, adding friction, like issue templates. And we call these best practices, but they're basically coping strategies, and they're kind of a defensive tactic. And if all else fails, maintainers aren't physically handcuffed to their projects either. Open source software is provided as is, which means that they're under no obligation, really, to maintain anything at all. So part of this coping strategy is also just making it easier for maintainers to hand off their projects and walk away if the work gets to be too much. And so all of that is fine and good. I could spend the rest of this talk just breaking down those strategies, and that's a really important area of work. But perhaps a certain thought has occurred to you, which is, wait a minute, isn't this open source? We can talk about helping maintainers learn to cope, but isn't part of the work also just getting more people to pitch in? To which I would say, yes, the production model that we have all been told to believe is that open source is all about contributing back. But as we've just learned, most popular projects, curiously, only have 1 or 2 maintainers. So the interesting question to consider is, given what we think about how open source works, why aren't there more maintainers? Why hasn't maintenance scaled beyond just 1 or 2 people? Isn't the system supposed to just magically work itself out? And so to answer that question, we have to briefly revisit where these assumptions come from in the first place. Why do we actually believe that users will become contributors and contributors will become maintainers? So somewhere between 2001, when Steve Ballmer called Linux a cancer, and 2016, when he changed his mind, we can probably say that open source won. The early 2000s put open source on the map right after the first .com bubble with the introduction of the LAMP stack. And then in the mid-2000s, there was this layer of innovation from Git and GitHub and Stack Overflow, and open source started to actually standardize into the set of norms that we see today. And then today, we've gone so far in the other direction that Microsoft is not only making headlines for its open source participation and hiring, but actually went ahead and acquired GitHub last summer. This is the image that was used to announce the acquisition. Microsoft loves GitHub now. And so my point here, I guess, is that open source is cool now. I think the acquisition really drove that home for me. It was remarkable that not just that Microsoft acquired GitHub, but that developers actually seemed excited about it. It's not just open source that's cool now, but Microsoft is cool now too. And for the most part, there wasn't a lot of upset or pushback. Everyone's willing to play nicely now. And so if it took us 20 years to get here, the world around open source has changed quite a bit. In the early 2000s, the battle being fought was between closed and open source. Companies like Microsoft were seen as the adversary, and the problem was convincing anyone to use open source in the first place. That battle was epitomized by Eric Raymond's essay, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which was first published to a wider audience in 1999. In this essay, Eric rejected the notion of cathedral-style software development, meaning the idea of software being built by just a few people. Instead, he proposed the bazaar, which was this utopian notion of software built in the open that was better and more secure because it was being reviewed and developed by hundreds of people instead of just one or two. Cathedral and Bazaar was the right argument for its time. That vision of the bazaar helped sell people on the benefits of using open source software by emphasizing its participatory aspects. But now that open source has millions of users, we have to come to terms with what we've done. The challenges we face today weren't part of the earlier narrative of open source because it was just written for a very different time. Most of the seminal research about how open source got produced was written in the early 2000s, and that became everything we operate from today. Academics hailed open source as this incredible model where people were building software for fun and not for profit. But they were overly optimistic about why programmers write code, and they forgot, or perhaps chose to ignore, the fact that software needs ongoing maintenance, which, to Dominic's point before, is just really not that fun. In the absence of money or status, it's just more responsibility without a pay rise. And so these days, we're dealing with a completely different universe. Today, GitHub adds more new users per month than SourceForge added during its entire lifetime. We had never put projects to this stress test of scalability. People had no idea what was going to happen when we got to this point. And it turns out maintenance doesn't actually grow with use because no one wants to do it. You fast forward a few years and open source kind of ended up looking like this. There is no bazaar. Most of the work in open source just ends up falling on a couple of people. And so the big question for today isn't how do we get more people to use open source, because open source is already the cultural default. The new question is, how do we scale this production model to meet this level of demand? Steve Klabnik, who's an open source developer known for his work in the Ruby and Rust communities, highlighted this discrepancy in a recent blog post where he points out that both the free and open source movements of the early days were about distribution and therefore consumption, but what people actually care about most today is the production of software. This is also the main challenge of whatever comes after open source. And so these problems are compounded by the fact that software development itself is changing in a couple of very important ways. Firstly, there are just way more developers today than there were in 2001, most of whom are new to this work. While it's probably a good thing long term, in the short to medium term, not only does it create more user demand, but new developers are more likely to have support questions, not feel comfortable contributing back, or struggle with the workflow when they do try to contribute. This experience, for example, puts a lot of strain on maintainers. Sindar Sorhus is one of the most active maintainers in JavaScript, and he noticed that 80% of contributors that he has to deal with don't actually know how to resolve a merge conflict. That means he has to do that work for them. There's a couple more observations that Sindar has made. Almost no one writes a good pull request title. 30% of people don't run their tests locally before submitting a PR. 40% don't include docs or tests. All this work ends up falling back onto maintainers. And even if we overcome these challenges, which I think are surmountable, the size and scope of open source projects themselves are changing. Software is fragmenting. We increasingly see more of these small or medium-ish projects with one maintainer working across multiple projects. Each project doesn't necessarily have its own community anymore. It's a fundamentally different structure from these big ecosystems with robust contributor communities. Those ecosystems will always exist. So today, you might think of something like Kubernetes or Rest. And in those situations, yes, getting more contributions can work pretty well in terms of scaling to meet demand. But while those projects capture our hearts as examples of human collaboration, it turns out that they are the exception. There's a 2015 analysis of the most popular projects on GitHub across languages where they found that big projects with over 1,000 contributors, like Django, Rails, or Linux, made up less than 3% of the popular projects they reviewed. And these are all-time contributions. So these really big bazaars don't represent the common experience of a popular project, even if they are the most mythologically captivating. And so when the researchers dug deeper, they found that half the total contributors to these projects only contribute once and never again. And if you want to guess what percent of commits that accounts for, it's less than 2%. So you have this very long tail of very small contributions. You might have hundreds of contributors overall, but the bulk of daily work is still being carried by just a couple of people. This is an example of what that looks like. This is a histogram of commits made to a project called Fastlane, broken up by contributor. You can see there's one person who's contributing a lot, who originally authored the project, with a very long tail of one-off contributions. These kinds of projects are never going to look like a bazaar. They may be part of a larger ecosystem, but they're not directly associated with it. Some of them aren't cool enough for anyone to want to contribute to, or they're too complex to contribute to, even if people continue to use and benefit from them. And so if fragmentation is a software pattern that we're getting used to, then we need to rethink the production model behind it. Some of that's resolvable in how projects themselves are set up, so things like automated testing and releases, shared configuration and tooling across projects. But part of it is just reorienting how we think about the makeup of a project's contributors. Vast majority of one-time contributors didn't come there to join a community. We know because researchers have asked them. They were there to fix a problem once and move on. And in fact, that long tail of people does make non-trivial contributions, and it's good that they're there. When they're not burdensome to manage, maintainers seem to universally like them. And yes, some of those contributors might get excited and want to stick around. Those are the stories that we tend to hear about. But I think there will always be this steady churn of people who do this once and never again. And maybe it's okay that they don't stick around. Our expectation of what these contributors are or what they should be is not actually rooted in reality. Most of the rhetoric around contributor communities works really well for the big projects, but it doesn't reflect the experience of smaller ones. Today, open source is doing an increasingly good job of catering to first-time contributors. This kind of work revolves around making your project welcoming, writing clear documentation, being responsive. These things do help attract new contributors, not to mention just making it a better experience for everyone. But ask a maintainer how well those first-time contributions are turning into repeat contributors, and they'll kind of furrow their brow and quietly muse that, well, it's not really about getting that first contribution that's a problem, but turning first-time contributors into second-time contributors. Over and over again, I hear maintainers wrestle with this feeling of guilt. They might personally spend hours and hours helping 100 people make their first contribution in hopes that one of them will stick around. Sometimes none of them do. This is hugely emotionally taxing. It also comes at the expense of other valuable project work. Most maintainers I've spoken to have found that the way they actually get people to stick around is by building relationships, not just pushing more people through this churn. And so what if we're just telling maintainers to optimize for a solution that doesn't actually lead to more help? And what does it cost maintainers to pursue a strategy that doesn't work? I worry that the rhetoric of the bazaar makes it hard to talk openly about these failures. At some point, when we're not seeing the results we want, we might want to try a different tactic. Casual contributions are a great way to build a wide volunteer base and encourage engagement, which is good for the long-term growth of the project. This is similar to getting a bunch of coworkers together to run a charity marathon or volunteer at a soup kitchen. It's less about the money, and it's more about community engagement. But who pays the people that run the kitchen? Who pays the staff that organizes the marathon? These are just two different kinds of problems, and we shouldn't conflate one for the other. For popular projects today, casual contributions are not a path to reducing overhead. We still need to figure out how to support maintenance work. I want to challenge the expectation that most volunteers are just maintainers waiting to happen, and that the contribution funnel is just broken, and if we somehow manage to fix it, all of the maintainers' problems would go away. And to some extent, we intuitively know this. You've probably experienced some version of this problem at work, also known as too many cooks in the kitchen. Adding lots of new people to a software project can slow down the process due to ramp-up time for new contributors, additional coordination costs, and limited divisibility of some tasks. It's not always easy to carve off the perfect first-time contributor issue. And so maintainers are making this trade-off right now between investing in new contributors, who will probably churn out, versus prioritizing the work they need to do in order to move the project forward. And if you're not yet convinced, I would ask this. What does it cost us, everyone in this room, as users and beneficiaries of this software, to pursue the wrong strategy? How much better could our software be if we weren't expecting maintainers of these tools to burn out and step down? If we weren't asking them to choose between writing code and onboarding new contributors? If they had the resources to be able to do both? This is a world I want to explore. It's natural for us to prioritize the solutions immediately in front of us because those are the areas where we feel we have the most control. It's a lot easier than imagining entire paradigm shifts. But if we could look ahead, beyond solving for the immediate short-term burden, and design for a future that's a little bit further away, we might find that we can create something really incredible. There's this quote from Jeff Hammerbacher of Cloudera that says, "The best minds of a generation are thinking about how to make people click ads." This quote really stuck with me over the years, and sometimes, when I think about the information costs that all of us experience with work, I think about how the best minds of our generation are spent checking email, checking notifications, and being responsive to other people's needs instead of proactively creating new things. That's a problem I think we can all relate to. And so by giving open source developers the resources to be proactive and not just reactive, we can unlock so much more potential in our software. So let's entertain this thought that maybe supporting open source isn't just about adding more people to the project, but supporting our existing maintainers. How do we get started? To answer that, I'm going to wrap up this talk with a couple of ideas that I hope you can take back to work with you. The first is just recognition. As trivial as it might seem, we still need to get everyone on the same page about what it's like to be a maintainer in open source today. You sat through this talk, so that's a good start. But if you're a developer, you're going to rely on and possibly have to interact with open source projects on a regular basis, for as long as you write code. And so a really simple thing that anyone could do here is just take a moment to put yourself in the maintainer's shoes before asking them for things. A lot of these people have day jobs, and they're maintaining the code that you use in their spare time. You can also take a minute to message a maintainer of a project that you personally use and love, and just let them know that you think it's awesome. Time and again, I've heard from maintainers that this sort of unexpected recognition and empathy goes a long way in making them feel seen and appreciated. If you're looking for stories around what it's like to maintain an open source project, I'm going to plug a collection that I maintain called Awesome Maintainers. There are a ton of videos, blog posts, and interviews here from the maintainers of a bunch of projects that you probably use or know about. So I would recommend that as a place to get started. Secondly, as a developer, you do have skills that you can use to make meaningful contributions back to a project. There's a difference between the extractive asks that masquerade as contributions versus contributions that do actually add value to a project. So there's sort of two parts here. One is just sort of encouraging everyone here to bias towards self-sufficiency. If you run into a problem with an open source project you use, instead of assuming that there's someone on the other end whose job it is to fix it for you, maybe start by asking yourself, can I fix it? Other part is, as a company, something you can advocate for internally is encouraging managers to allow employees to contribute to open source during work time. When contributing back becomes a normalized part of the workplace, it fosters this culture of developers pitching in instead of expecting that a faceless maintainer will do all this work for us. If you're new to contributing to open source, I will point you to a set of resources that one of my former colleagues at GitHub put together, Open Source Friday, to encourage employees to regularly contribute to open source, as well as provide resources for you to make the case to your manager. And finally, the last area that's worth thinking about are sponsorships, particularly if you're thinking from your capacity as an employee with a budget that you can allocate towards development work. The highest leverage place to fund open source work is to fund maintainers themselves. So ask them what they need help with, whether it's sponsoring their time or some of their project expenses like paid tools or services, conference travel, or meeting up with their fellow maintainers. Again, every project is different in terms of what they need. To share a few examples here, Coinbase started an open source fund where they allocate money towards open source projects that they use using a site called Open Collective, which makes it easy to disperse funds to projects. Facebook, Airbnb, Cloudflare are a few more examples of companies that have spun up similar funds. It's also cool to see that these funds tend to start as internal initiatives from engineering teams themselves. So Jory, who announced the fund here, is a software engineer at Coinbase. I mentioned Webpack earlier in this talk. Webpack is a JavaScript module that is primarily maintained by one developer named Tobias Koppers. Another maintainer, Sean Larkin, decided to take on this project a few years ago, where he dedicated himself to evangelizing Webpack and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to support Tobias's work. It's a pretty incredible story that I encourage you to read about on your own time. And so one of their major sponsors is this company called Trivago, which is a travel website for comparing hotel prices. Trivago had this really good experience sponsoring Webpack in ways they didn't even personally expect. And so Patrick Goddard, who runs front-end engineering at Trivago, said that all the public visibility put them in this situation where they suddenly became one of the most interesting companies to work for as a JavaScript developer. They hired a bunch of great engineers who mentioned during their job interview that Trivago's sponsorship of Webpack was one of their primary motivations for applying. I'll also mention that a few weeks ago, GitHub just announced the launch of Sponsors, where you can sponsor developers' work directly through GitHub's platform. It's still in beta, so there are a limited number of developers you can sponsor, but I encourage you to check it out. GitHub is also matching all sponsorships to developers for the first year, so you can literally double your impact by just going on GitHub and sponsoring a developer today. So one thing I hope you take away from this is that we really are dealing with a brand new world. Open source is in a totally different place from where it was 20 years ago, and we don't really know how to manage it yet. But if nothing else, I hope to challenge you and myself to think bigger about this opportunity. To think beyond palliative care and coping strategies for maintainers, because that's a pretty terrible way to build the open source infrastructure that we all rely on. When you look at the numbers and you look at how rapidly things are changing, it becomes pretty clear that there's a complex and critically important ecosystem here. And just like any ecosystem, when new environmental threats are introduced, in order to find equilibrium again, the ecosystem needs to evolve. We need to rethink our expectations for how open source is managed in a world like today, when open source has already won on the consumer side, but still has a lot of open questions on the production side. And it's early enough that the steps we take today will be hugely impactful in how future generations think about and engage with open source. Thank you.